Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I always forget that. Can somebody give me a shout out? Let me know you can hear me and to see my slides. Yeah, okay, great.
Yes, we can hear and see, thanks.
Okay, so it's just 10 o'clock now. If it's, maybe we'll have a few people coming in a little bit late. Phil is on his way. I don't see if he's in here yet, but I'm just gonna go ahead and get started. So my name is Regina Ostergaard-Klem, and I'm an associate professor of environmental science at Hawaii Pacific University, HPU. So I'm calling in from Kaneohe, Hawaii, on the island of Oahu this morning, for me this morning. So welcome to everyone from all over the place. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am also a board member of USSEE, and I wanted to give a shout out to Erin Lennox, who's our executive director. She's on today. She'll be monitoring the chat box. And also to Robbie Richardson, who's our current president, her current chair for USSEE for the board. And Phil Warsaw is also, he'll be the second speaker today. He's also a board member. So I just want to encourage everyone that if you have any questions about USSEE, about our webinars, our resources, or if you're interested in getting involved, feel free to reach out to any of us, and we're happy to share some information. Hello to everyone else there, whether you're a member of USSEE or not, or whether you've been working in this field for 2 decades, or researching or teaching, or maybe you're just new today to ecological economics, thought it was interesting and you'd like to learn more. We welcome everyone. Let me just give a little background on, let's see. Okay, so just a little background on why we are here today and how we've decided to launch this webinar series for the spring semesters for the spring, from now until May. I think we have some webinars planned out and into the summer. So we've decided on the title of the webinar series for the post-COVID economy, centering justice and sustaining ecosystems. And really just to get a sense for where this came from, during our regular board meetings over the course of the last year, with all of the all of the critical events that have been happening, it's just was so apparent to us that all of these inequities and injustices were being revealed. These were already existing in society, already existing within the systems, but due to the global pandemic and COVID and Black Lives Matter and elections and all other things that were happening here in the US and globally, it became very apparent to us that this was just something that we need to address. So in thinking about how we could, as a board, how we could reach out to our audience, to the larger audience, and try to get the conversation started. And what are some of the things that we might need to be looking at more closely, more broadly? And so today is really just the kickoff of this series and a way to frame the conversation for where we can move on from here. So it's not just about building back better. You hear that term all the time about building back better in the post-COVID world. But I would argue it's also about building forward better. It's a term I heard the other day that really spoke to me. And again, it's about asking ourselves and discussing what should be the role of ecological economics within this post-COVID world. So I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so framing the conversation, and then we'll hand it over to Phil Warsaw, and hopefully framing the conversation not just for today's webinar, but for the webinars that will continue to be added on throughout the series throughout this next year. So today I'm going to talk about what are the fundamental principles under ecological economics that are relevant to this new world that we're living in. I'm going to brush upon some of the work that's already being done, just a very, tiny little subsection of work that's being done, but, again, framing the conversation for others to let us know and to be, to share information about what work is already being done that fits under these principles. How and what can we learn from others? Not just within the ecological economics field, but because we're transdisciplinary from all the other colleagues that we work with across other disciplines. Um, and really asking the question, what does ecological economics need to do? Do we need to expand to be more targeted? Do we need to have a more coordinated response to many of the things that are occurring these days? So to start out with some of the fundamentals of ecological economics, and again, this is, maybe you've been in the field for 20 years, or maybe this is the first time that you've heard the term. So I'm not quite sure who we have out in the audience. So, but just to go over a little bit of the fundamentals. And I find that, and maybe many of you find this as well, that I find that sometimes to present ecological economics, it's easier to present what it is not rather than what it is. So I typically, for my students, I typically start out with this diagram, which they should be familiar with from their, Econ 101 class, and then proceed to think about, well, okay, if this is our conventional economic system based on the neoclassical model of circular flow of exchange value, think about where you are within this system, and think about how this describes our everyday lives in our society. But then think about, well, what's missing from this model? And right away we can say, well, we're not thinking about natural resources, either from sources or for sinks. We can talk about how, what about limits to the ecosystem, and draw a box around it. We can talk about things that are not being recognized in this circular flow of exchange value, that especially when it's focused so much on gross domestic product as an indicator of growing the economy. What happens to things like unpaid care, the unpaid care economy? That's missing from the model as well. And then, of course, you can throw the social inequity in there, and that's not being captured in the model. So, so it's raising awareness of, if we're looking at our conventional systems, neoclassical models, how is it that we need to do better? And what does ecological economics offer in the way of the fundamentals of a different model? So right away, we start out with ecological economics just based on the name of the discipline itself. That there's this interdependency between not only just the economy, but the ecological systems as well. And that humans are a part of that. It's not separate from it, but that it's a part of it. And of course, one of the biggest fundamental ideas behind ecological economics is that of transdisciplinarity. I mentioned this before, right? So it's instead of a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, it's where there's a goal above and beyond just working across disciplines, that there's a mutual goal that we're all working towards. So this slide, when I throw this slide up, this is where this is typically where I get the duh moment from my students, where and I explain that, under the ecological economics model, that the economy is a subset of the overall containing and constraining ecosystem. And, most of the students are like, well, yeah, that just makes so much sense. So it's, this is the classic example, the empty world versus the full world, of how ecological economics explains how, looking at the intersections between social and economic systems and the ecosystem, and relying on the laws of thermodynamics to inform those decisions. We have finite matter, and we have to deal with entropy. So we end up living in a full world. We're living in a full world where it's full of our stuff, and we're limited and constrained by a lack of natural capital, and creating pressures as the economy grows and bumps up against those constraints that are there, the ecological constraints that are there. How should we proceed? And empty world accounting, this is where I call this the go west young man type of mentality. That's how I explain it to my students, that an empty world was when it was, we were limited by the amount of man-made capital that we had to actually use an abundance of natural resources. And this is, 100 years ago, 150 years ago. And that often a way to look at it is that our current conventional economy is, operating under the premise that we're living in an empty world accounting, when in fact we're living in a full world. And ecological economics exposes that. A few other fundamentals that I think are relevant to the conversation that we're having is the idea of strong sustainability versus weak sustainability. So, it's the idea of what is the role that technology and man-made capital can play within our system. And strong sustainability for ecological economics, we recognize that natural capital is critical. It provides ecosystem goods and services, and it can't be replaced readily and easily by technology and man-made capital, unlike what the view is in conventional circles. A fundamental idea is to move to a steady state economy, with the idea of creating constant throughput, recognizing that we're mass finite, and that we're limited by the ecosystem services and goods that we have. And another key idea is that we can't rely on the market to fix the market. That many of these externalities and many of the inequities that we see can be a direct result of relying on the market for allocation. And we can't continue to rely on the market for that, but we need to have others to come in and play a role, other institutions or even government. This is one of my favorites because I tend to work in this space about the beyond GDP. We need to separate the costs of growth, the externalities that result from economic growth, and we need to separate them from the benefits, which, if we're relying on a more conventional system, like, using GDP to track economic growth and growth is good, more is better, and frankly, in the neoclassical sense, ecological economics comes in and says, no, we need to separate those out. We need to recognize that they're two separate things. And there's the part of the discipline that goes beyond GDP. And this is where we're looking at social justice and income inequality, unpaid work, many of those things that I showed in the beginning slides that were missing from that, the typical circular flow diagram. So 3 basic goals of ecological economics, that is, the mantra. I tell my students, you need to have this like it's, on the back of your hand. You should know these 3 goals, right, of ecological economics. And it's efficient allocation, it's just distribution, and it's sustainable scale. So efficient allocation, when we're asking, what are we going to make and how much based on, scarce resources and what the market will bear. But then we move on to the idea of just distribution. It's who gets it, right? So, and we can't rely on the market to address the issues of distribution and whether it's fair or just. And sustainable scale is that's the size of the economy relative to the overarching containing and constraining ecosystem. It's something that we need to think about, as opposed to looking at natural capital as just another input of production, and that it's unlimited as in previous models. So where this really falls onto the idea of overlapping in today's world, what I mean about today's world in the post, now and into the future post COVID. So I'd like to call out 2 of these things. So this is where I see there's an inherent an embedded idea towards if we're talking about inequity and disparities and justice, right, for all of those different terms. And those, whether it's what has become so relevant through the through our what we've been going through the last several months for COVID, whether it's disparities in health outcomes, whether it's digital equity, the issue of digital equity and distance learning, now that all of our students have been out of physically outside of the classroom, or whether it's in terms of employment and equities in terms of who's actually deemed an essential employee. So many of the issues that we need to talk about, and can that be captured through these fundamental ideas of ecological economics? And one surely is just distribution, that idea, whether it focuses primarily on distribution of income and wealth, whether it can be expanded to include some of the other disparities. That's the type of conversations that I'd like to see start happening. And then, of course, sustainable scale is inherently related to equity. because sustainability is basically equity and intergenerationally. So, if we're talking about equity between, now and our future generations, that's what sustainability is all about. And making decisions now, keeping that in mind, is really intergenerational equity. So I, so looking back at this and preparing for this presentation, I took some time to go back through the Journal of Ecological Economics, since that's a representative of, many of the people who work in this field, and decided to take a short stroll through some recent um, volumes, just to get a sense for, like, okay, so if I wanted to search for inequity or justice or different keywords that are related to this topic that we're talking about, what do I get back? And what I found was that, and again, this is a very small sample size. I looked over the last several years, but what I found was that there's a great variety in the topics that are being published, right? The articles that are being published, the research that's being done. And I think that some of these will serve as, there's existing work that we could leverage. People are doing work that's out there that we could leverage. But I think it also shows that there's such a great variety that maybe there needs to be more of a way to kind of categorize these, and highlight this work and other work so that it's more focused on the particular issues at hand. So one example, of course, talking about carbon pricing and equity, social and environmental justice implications of monetary valuation, right? That's interesting. Here's one topic where I think we can really learn a lot, that we can really expand on the conversation of the feminist perspectives in ecological economics and justice frameworks. Justice and nature-based climate solutions. We have technology-driven inequities, and how that might lead to more resource degradation, right? So, and also talking about gender equity in extractive industries like fisheries, or social equity even in something that's more specific like payment for ecosystem services. How do we account for social equities and inequities there? So just a kind of broad brush idea of what's out there in the literature, at least within the Journal of Ecological Economics, and how can we leverage that? How can we learn from practitioners, people who are out there already doing equity work, already doing justice work? So this, I'd like to share this slide. This comes from a colleague of mine from the City and County Office of Climate Change, Sustainability and Resiliency in Honolulu, right? So City and County of Honolulu. This is my colleague Lala Nuss, who's been doing a fantastic job of tying in equity to all things resiliency related to in Honolulu and into our state writ large. And I thought this was just a great idea and illustration of, that there's many different dimensions of equity. It can go from procedural, it can go from distributional, which tends to be what's more in, the ecological economics model when we talk about just distribution. But, are there structural inequities, procedural inequities? Are people being, not included in the decision-making process? Transgenerational equity, that's the sustainability, right? Totally overlaps with ecological economics. But what about culture? Particularly here in Hawaii, we have issues that need to be addressed based on the history here, right? How else can we learn from practitioners? And this is one of my favorite slides to put in here, where it's, from Kate Rayworth. So she's gotten a lot of press recently. She recently, since the pandemic has happened, there was a talk story that she had, a panel discussion that she had with Herman Daly about COVID. And, she's been doing a lot of work and getting a lot of attention too. So I wanted to bring this up here when we're talking about donut economics in Kate Rayworth's model. And how does that expand on the the fundamental principles of ecological economics? And is it taking it, further down the road? And is it something that, more people should be aware of and more people should try to incorporate it into their work? But basically, if you're not familiar with donut economics, The premise is that she has taken the 9 planetary boundaries, the idea of the 9 planetary boundaries from Rockstrom, which you see on the outer circle here, and the pressure that that human society is putting onto the environment, and with the underlying threat of overshooting. These are basically, this is talking about the constraining and containing ecosystem of ecological economics. But also she puts inside here about the social foundation, where it's basically looking at making sure needs and human needs and basic ideas, basic needs are being met from the social side, right? And then she defines this donut here, the safe and just space for humanity, so that we're not overshooting our environmental and ecosystem boundaries, limits to growth, or limits to development, I should say, is more like it. But then we're making sure that everybody is thriving. That's that we're staying outside of the we're not having shortfalls in terms of our basic needs. So this is actually just came out in Time magazine recently, a recent article on donut economics. But I just wanted to point out some of the work that she's doing, she and her folks are doing in the Donut Economics Action Lab, so DEAL for short, and just calling out. So Amsterdam is applying donut economics to their planning. Brussels is also exploring how they can apply that to their residents, making sure residents are thriving and not at the expense of, the ecosystem and, frankly, the global ecosystems and global populations. So, just throwing it out there, something really to think about and some models to look more into. So this is my last slide before I switch over to Phil Warsaw. And I think we're doing okay on time so far. So basically, these are the questions that I want to leave with you today, and questions that I hope to help spur conversation. And again, Erin Lennox is manning or personing the chat box. So if you have comments and questions that are coming up all along, she'll be tracking that in the chat box. But these are just questions I want to throw out there. So if ecological economics inherently addresses equity, within some of the fundamental principles, including, distribution when we talk about just and fair distribution, as well as scale when we talk about intergenerational equity and sustainability. So, but what's missing? And, not only what's missing, but is the message that comes from ecological economics loud enough to be heard by the larger community? And then is ecological economics poised to raise and to further expand this topic, the topics of equity and justice within our field? And so, how do we take the next steps? How do we prepare for that? How do we provide the context and, further introspection here, and maybe further coordination, across disciplines within our own discipline? And how do we expand this? So those are the questions that I'd like to leave everybody with at this point. Phil, are you there? Are you ready to start your?
I am. Thanks, Regina.
Actually, Regina, there is one question
Yeah.
before you sign out and turn it over to Phil. Someone has posted a question. I agree that just distribution cannot be done through the market. The question is, should the market be the fundamental mechanism for efficient production? If production is dominated by the market, will that impede non-market based just transition?
Yeah, exactly. I don't have an answer to that. I don't have a clear answer to that. And I think that's something that is part of these, questions. How do we overlap the fundamentals of it with what's reality? So, and again, so basic ecological economics is, let's start with scale first, right? We'll start with sustainable scale first. We're going to flip it on the side. Don't start with efficient allocation. Start with scale first, defining that, and then address just and fair distribution, and then we can maybe see what's the role of the market to play in efficient allocation after those goals are already addressed. But I agree. I think that's great. Let's keep that out there and keep that in mind. Just perfect kind of question that I think we should continue the conversation on. Okay.
Great. And then if you, Gina, just want to, I think I should be able to share directly from my screen if you, okay. All right, so I think Regina left this off at a great point, and I just want to pick off essentially right where she left off. And what I want to do is talk about why we chose this topic in this moment, grounding our discussion of justice within the current crisis that we're facing on multiple levels, and talk a little bit about what environmental justice might look like within ecological economics, what the field has already been doing, and how we might try to move forward and integrate the idea of justice more deeply within the discipline. And so, as I'm sure many of you know, one of the most pressing headlines that have come out of this crisis is just how much it has deepened existing inequality, particularly income and wealth inequality within not just the United States, but globally. And so most of what I'll be talking about is focused on the US, but these trends can obviously be extrapolated across the globe. Many in the United States, many of the richest among us have been doing quite well, with figures like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk now being worth, I believe, actually over 200 billion. I think these numbers are even out of date. But overall, many of the richest among us have been doing very well as we've seen our economies shift towards online production or online distribution and purchasing of goods, and away from a lot of the physical labor that takes place in storefronts. As a result, many of our low-wage workers in particular, workers across the board, but in particular, low-wage workers have been subject to both job loss and, as a result, negative impacts on their income, with a disproportionate number of those jobs, again, being low-wage jobs that are lost. Another crisis that has emerged during this COVID-19 pandemic has been one of racial injustice. Obviously, many of us saw the George Floyd protests that took place over the summer in protest against racial inequality, racial injustice, and police brutality. But this is not the only realm in which we have seen and experienced racial injustice. Thinking about COVID-19, many of our low-wage workers are people of color. And so as a result, a disproportionate number of Black and Latinx households have been impacted both by an inability to pay rent and a likelihood to face food insecurity during this pandemic. Of those who are still working, many of them, as we also know, have been many people of color have been frontline workers, in particular in our meat production or in our food production, where we have a disproportionate share of Latinx individuals, particularly in meat processing, where we had several major outbreaks of COVID-19 early on in the pandemic. And all of these trends, combined with already existing trends of environmental inequity and injustice, such as disproportionate exposure to air pollution, have all resulted in what we've seen from a public health perspective, which is the disproportionate rates of death among African American, our Native and Indigenous populations, and our Latinx populations in the United States. And so we can see how COVID-19 has manifested in these economic ways, these crises of both economic insecurity and public health and negative public health outcomes. At the same time, while this has been less discussed, COVID-19 has revealed the ongoing need and crisis regarding our climate and our environment. Early on, there was some, I would say, somewhat glib talk about how the pandemic actually wasn't too bad because on the bright side, at least carbon emissions were coming down. But now that we are in 2021, the actual results are coming in, and the news is it actually isn't as good as we thought. While COVID has resulted in carbon emissions dropping in 2020 in many countries such as China, which have more or less come back to full capacity in terms of their economy, we are seeing carbon emissions back to where they were before, or starting to exceed their 2020 or even pre-pandemic levels. And there's very little reason to think that the same won't be true in the Western world as those economies begin to pick up steam with the arrival of the vaccine. In addition, even if we argue that the COVID-19 pandemic has been beneficial from a carbon emissions perspective, the fact remains that the pandemic itself is in part a reflection of ongoing environmental degradation. The origins of COVID-19 are generally understood to be from a wet market in China, in Wuhan, China. But the origins of the COVID-19 are more fundamentally than that, thought to be the result of ongoing destruction of natural environments for wildlife, which then means that humans come into contact with zoonotic viruses and diseases that they would not normally come in contact with. And so as a result, COVID-19 is a reflection of not just the climate crisis, but of ongoing environmental degradation. In addition, what this has revealed to us is the ongoing concern about environmental or ecological tipping points, in a sense, because there's no indication as to when or which patch of forest, which environment being destroyed is going to be the one that's going to send us into a 15-month and ongoing long pandemic, and or likewise, what's going to be the tipping point that's going to lead us into greater ecological catastrophe or climate catastrophe. And so as a result, there's been a growing interest in trying to rethink how we do economics. So what you see here is a headline in the Rolling Stone of all places about degrowing the economy. And so for us as ecological economists, in many ways, this represents an opportunity to take what we have done, what we do as scholars, and to try to present it as an alternative to the economic systems of which support endless growth that are dominant across the globe. And so this is what brings me to my discussion of where environmental justice and equity fit into these ongoing conversations. Regina brought up a lot of great frameworks in terms of how we as scholars within ecological economics have thought about the questions of equity and justice. One framework that I want to add into this is environmentalism of the poor, which is a framework first presented by Joan Martinez-Allier in his book, The Environmentalism of the Poor, and then reproduced in an updated version in an article within Ecological Economics in 2014 with Isabel Engelowski. And in this framework, Martinez-Allier describes three essentially movements or three versions of the environmentalism movement. In the first, you have the cult of wilderness, which broadly speaking is represented by international organizations such as the Sierra Club, World Wildlife Foundation. And the concern of the quote unquote cult of wilderness is on protecting ecosystems as a necessity to keep or protecting natural environments and ecosystems as a way to keep our planet functioning as intended. Now, in many cases, this can be at the expense of humans who maybe rely on those natural environments, but the idea is nonetheless a focus on preserving the environment as a matter of first order priority. Second, you have what he calls the gospel of eco-efficiency, which focuses on, for lack of a better word, on the sort of win-win solutions between eco-modernization, eco-growth, or green growth, and environmental protection. So in many ways, the language you often hear around the Green New Deal, as this is great for the economy. We actually want the Green New Deal because sustainability is good business. And in many ways, what Martinez-Allier argues and what you see in many circles within ecological economics is an alliance between these first two movements of environmentalism, in that the folks who are primarily concerned with the preservation of the environment have increasingly relied on economic terms in order to try to communicate the importance of preserving the environment. There may not be an explicit market for the ecosystem services or the functions that our ecosystems provide for us as humans. But if we can communicate that value in monetary terms, the argument is, even if there's not a market, we can at least move policymakers and stakeholders in the direction of conservation if they know how much it's worth. This aligns well with scholars and activists who see the use of markets and monetary valuation as a way to make markets run better. And so much of the literature is representative of this alliance, with less attention being focused on environmental justice, not to say that equity is not a central concern, because it is within the field, but less on justice as self-determination, but rather as equity of outcome, equity of distribution as a result of economic processes as it relates and interacts with the environment. A great example that Martinez-Elliott points out in this alliance between the cult of wilderness and the gospel of eco-efficiency is the framework of the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. And so essentially what this framework does is it connects the provision of ecosystem services. So we have our ecosystems, which provide functions that regulate, our ecosystems have processes which provide services, whether it be food, services that regulate the ecosystem, habitats for biodiversity, or cultural benefits to us in terms of recreation, aesthetic values, which then translate to human well-being. And so as a result of these benefits, we have to be cautious about how we are governing our ecosystems, which then is represented by this box, which describes the need for governance and decision-making, which takes into account all of the benefits that our ecosystem provide for us, other than as beyond just materials for production and for consumption. Now, the challenge here, as it relates to equity, the idea of equity versus justice, is that on the one hand, this sort of language around valuing nature appropriately is useful in so much as it gives us a way to try to characterize the benefits or the potential harm that can be done to communities based on how we manage our ecosystems. At the same time, what Angelowski and Martinez-Elliott argue is that this same commodification can cause other justice impacts beyond whether or not we're distributing benefits and costs efficiently. In particular, by creating new markets for investors and consumers, what we're doing is we're taking away, in many cases, the self-determination of local communities to decide what their own relationship with their environments are going to be. So perhaps a community in an indigenous community doesn't really, in North America, doesn't really see their land in strict terms of, well, if we build a pipeline, then it's going to be worth this much, but if we turn it into a natural park, then it's going to be worth this much, and we can make sure we compensate you appropriately for it, but we're going to take your land. In that case, even if you're compensating people for their loss, so quote unquote, it misses the broader justice concern about whether or not communities should have self-determination for their communities. And an example of where this gap exists is with the 2010 Economics of Ecosystem Services Benefits report, which introduced this idea of net positive impact. It was commissioned by several international wildlife organizations, such as the World Wildlife Fund, and it praised a metal extractive or a natural resource extraction company called Rio Tinto for offsetting their mining operations with supporting the development and preservation of natural parks. Even if on balance there is the impact is net zero, and even if you're compensating people for their work and for the development of this park, a justice concern is, what about the workers who are in these mining operations? What about the communities who had their lands maybe taken away to support these mining operations? And so a distinction that I want to make here then is between the idea of environmental equity and environmental justice. And equity is often what we center within both neoclassical economic approaches to the environment, but also what's rooted in much of our work as ecological economics. And there's a focus on the distribution of amenities and hazards, which then implies a focus on measuring what those risks and values are, as opposed to questioning whether or not we should be producing those risks to begin with. And that's not to say that this approach isn't important, because it absolutely is. And to ground our work in that approach is of vital importance. But also as a field, I think some of the frameworks that Regina mentioned also push us to push beyond that, to then think about justice as not just equity, not just evenness of distribution, but on the self-determination and liberation of communities to be able to decide how they see their own lives going. Now, this is obviously much more difficult to measure and implies a need for a transdisciplinary and systems-based approach, which, as it happens, is in many ways what we as a field and we as ecological economists claim to be doing. And so to bring in the donut again that Regina mentioned, I would note that the foundation that Kate Raworth places within our economy is on justice. And the reason for that is, without justice, and many environmental justice activists argue, without justice, there can be no protection for the environment. Likewise, there can be no protection of the environment without justice. And I want to go over a fairly quick example. I know we're at 3:40 already, and I want to make sure we have time for some questions. But I want to ground what I'm talking about in the abstract into an actual example. So I quickly want to talk about the roots of the environmental justice movement in the United States and how I see that relating to this ongoing need to take what we've started here as a field and to continue to expand it, and where I see this webinar series going. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the environmental justice movement, or the modern environmental justice movement, is commonly understood to have begun in the late 1970s in Warren County, North Carolina. In 1978, the Ward Transformer Company dumped oil on street shoulders, in part because of new regulations put in by the EPA, which made dumping oil more expensive. The Ward Transformation Company decided to try to skirt those regulations by, instead of dumping oil legally, simply dumping it on the streets. And what they did is they dumped over 31,000 barrels of oil across 13 counties in North Carolina in a time span of 2 weeks. And as a result, there were 60,000 tons of earth that were contaminated. And so almost immediately afterwards, there was a cry out due to other instances of environmental contamination, such as the Love Canal in New York, to address this contaminated soil immediately. And so in meetings immediately after the discovering of this contaminated soil, Afton, North Carolina was chosen as the site for the contaminated soil. And it was chosen, many argue, because of its relative lack of political power. It was 65% African American, 97 out of 100 counties in the state in GDP, and 40% of the homes didn't even have indoor plumbing. Following the decision to make Afton, North Carolina, the site, there were 800 people who protested follow-up hearings on the decision to choose that to use that as the site. And between 1971 to 1981, there was extensive litigation led by a multiracial, multi-organizational coalition to try to resist the choosing of the site for the contaminated soil. In 1982, however, they were given the state was given the go-ahead to create a landfill in Afton, North Carolina, which then led to widespread protests led by the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, who led actions for 6 weeks while the soil was being delivered to this site. Ultimately, through their actions, some of which you see in these pictures here, laying out in the street to prevent trucks from coming through, and mass marches, they were able to delay, but ultimately not stop the landfill project. However, what's interesting about this moment is the way that it inspired the rise of a coalition to question not just the equity of where this soil was being dumped, but also the justice of whether or not it should have been created to begin with. And so as a quick aside, much of the initial protest against this, this decision to dump waste in Afton, North Carolina, was actually based out of the NIMBY movement, which for those of you who aren't aware, that's the not in my backyard movement, which describes people who get involved in environmental issues only in so much as they affect their own individual communities and well-being. And that was much of the initial focus of the struggle against the decision to dump soil in Afton, North Carolina. And it was led by local white environmental organizations such as Concerned Citizens of North Carolina, who were initially reluctant to focus on the dumping of soil in this county as a issue of injustice and more on an issue of the impact on the local environment. And they appealed, of all administrations, to the Reagan administration to help them and suggested shifting the dumping of the soil to an existing site in Alabama. Ultimately, they failed, surprise, in part because of the extensive costs that were going to be involved in moving the soil from North Carolina to Alabama. So that cost-benefit analysis, which is often used in these sort of studies, ultimately proved unuseful. So what they did was they ultimately relented and built a coalition with the Black residents of Warren County who had recently gained increased political power post-Voting Rights Act and shifted their alignment from the environment specifically to the impact on the residents. So by leading with the uneven impacts on, or the not just the uneven impacts, but the actual impacts on their residents, they were able to come up with an alignment that brought multiple organizations, multiple coalitions into a single movement to try to resist this environmental degradation. And following that coalition, we begin to see the environmental justice movement expand and how they think about environmental protection. In the years after the Warren County incident, a report was prepared by the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, describing the patterns of spatial correlations between race and the location of hazardous waste sites in the United States, finding clear and consistent patterns of racial discrimination or racial injustice as it relates to the siting of these sites. And all of this led and culminated in the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit held in 1991, which featured delegations from the African American community, Latinx populations, Native and Indigenous people, and representing not just a multiracial coalition, but also a coalition including members of the labor movement, educators, and academics, all from all states of the United States, plus the entirety, essentially, of both North and South America. And one of the key themes of this conference was the idea of not just in my backyard, but not in anyone's backyard. And so you can see we're moving from this idea of just equity to an idea of justice, which actually questions, should we be producing these sort of toxins to begin with? And so out of that conference came what are called the principles of environmental justice, which I recognize are a bit hard to read here, but I pulled out a couple that I wanted to quickly highlight with the time that I have left, which that environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the right to be free from ecological destruction, while also affirming the fundamental right to political, economic, and cultural self-determination of all people. And so here we've gone from a focus on just a local concern about the local environmental conditions to a justice framework which goes beyond that and brings in the necessity to protect the earth from ecological destruction in order to ensure justice. And so tying this back to the environmentalism of the poor framework that Martinez-Aillet develops, in that 2014 article, they talk about a similar crisis of environmental injustice around hazardous waste sites. And there are two quotes that I quickly want to highlight here. The first talks about or starts to get at this idea of how these environmental crises and ecological crises and economic crises are all tied together in a broader system. And you can see in this quote that the interviewee is discussing that, well, it's not enough to talk about hazardous waste sites, because as soon as you go from there, then you start talking about air quality, which then ties into the economy, which ties into housing, which ties into energy, so on and so forth. And so all of these issues are, you can't separate them into wildlife preservation or eco-efficiency or environmental justice, because justice is, whether we think about it explicitly or not, is inherently tied in with all of these ideas. To put it more simply, Angelowski and Martinez-Allies condense these ideas into the following quote, that environmental justice cannot be envisioned without equitable and sustainable community development. And in return, community development cannot be envisioned without environmental quality and justice in mind. And so coming back to the donut, it gives us another way of thinking about what Rayworth calls the social foundation for the economy. It's not just a foundation in so much as, well, we just want to make sure everyone is well provided for. Another way of interpreting that is that without the pursuit of justice, without the pursuit of not just equity, but this broader and more radical version of justice, we can't actually pursue an economy that's going to be contained within the ecological ceiling. As soon as we allow injustice to occur, as soon as we say, well, it's okay if some people are exposed to hazardous waste because that's just how it is, then we've immediately allowed the possibility that this waste is going to be continued to be produced in perpetuity. And now it's not to say that we can move to a utopian world where none of these things happen, but the way that I view the donut is as a way to reframe what we as both academics, as activists, and as citizens begin to think is within the realm of possibilities. And I just want to very quickly end by talking about what this means for those of us who are in the audience who are academics. And going back to very quickly the story of Warren County, many scholars, such as Robert Bullard, who is considered the father of the environmental justice movement, became intimately involved with this movement after the Warren County crisis. And specifically in the early 1990s, a group of academics came together to figure out how they could best support this burgeoning movement. And they specifically discussed what they would be able to sacrifice in order to be able to make that happen. And specifically, they discussed giving up or not more focusing on publishing their papers in, these high-level journals that were completely cut off from the public, but instead focusing on getting as much of their work out into the public to support the public and support communities who were engaged in struggles of environmental injustice. And using their influence, because as academics, they had a certain prestige laid upon them, to be able to move agencies to act. And so the EPA Working Group on Environmental Equity, which eventually became the Commission on Environmental Justice, came directly out of that movement. And so it's important, as I wrap up here, and a thought I want to leave us with is for us as either academics, as activists, or activist scholars, how do we see ourselves as being able to build synergy with the communities that we work with in order to integrate these versions of this broader notion of justice in our work? And how do we then translate that into action that can then translate to meaningful change at the policy level? And so I will stop there, and I suppose, Erin, do we have some questions here?
Yes, there are a few questions in the chat box. Would you like me to read them out to you?
Sure.
So first we have one that says, do you see any tension between prioritizing EJ and equity and mobilizing resources rapidly to stabilize cumulative emissions, particularly from private innovators, et cetera? The rhetoric seems to revolve around rapid financial and resource mobilization due to the existential nature of the climate crisis. There also seems to be much less interest in nature-based solutions on the whole.
I would be interested in hearing Regina's perspective on this as well, but I would say I am in general, I see there being inherent tension between the two. Simply because when we talk about mobilizing financial capital quickly that often refers to mobilizing private capital. And one of the central tensions within ecological economics that I think we as scholars have identified very accurately is that when you put in an incentive for profit or for growth, it often puts pressure on communities to want to engage in behaviors that don't necessarily lead to a justice-centered approach to environmental sustainability. And so I do think we need to be thinking aggressively about rapid action and response. But I think we also need to start thinking about what it looks like to have a more community-centered approach, one in which we're allowing the public to mobilize those resources as opposed to relying on private investors and private markets to do that work for us.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Phil. And I would also suggest that, yeah, it's a potential hazard. It's a potential weakness in the system, getting those funds out so quickly. But I think what needs to be done is to really focus on a lot of the networks that have already been developed and that are already functioning, so that so that the community engagement is already there. There's representatives of communities, and I think engaging those organizations or engaging those people into the decision-making process is what's going to be key. And as so ecological economics, it's transdisciplinary. That's the name of the game, to think more systems wide, even if it is even if it is trying to push a more command and control approach because of the existential threat. I think that there is room definitely to include the community. And I think that a lot of those networks are out there. They just have to be better utilized. So.
The next question is, does justice imply an extreme decentralization of institutions?
I'm going to punt to Phil on that one.
That is a great question, and one that we could probably spend an entire hour discussing. There's certainly a tradition, particularly within the ecological economics field, among degrowth economists, and outside of economics among decolonization scholars and others who argue that in order to pursue justice, we actually have to rethink our relationship to the state in general, and what role does, say, the U.S. government and their incentives and their desire to maintain themselves as an empire in terms of environmental justice or environmental sustainability. There certainly is not a consensus around that, and in the immediate term, you're not going to see massive decentralization in the short term, but in a theoretical sense, or even in a long-term practical sense, I do think there is a question about what relationship communities have to the state as a large national entity, in terms of whether or not you can achieve true justice in that sense.
And finally, one that's somewhat for everyone. It says, for those of you on college, university campuses, do you see a meaningful response to justice concerns from your neoclassical economist colleagues? Do you think more widespread awareness of racial and economic injustice could help to raise the profile of ecological economics on campuses relative to the still dominant neoclassical paradigm?
I'll go ahead and try a stab at that. So, hi, Ken. It's Ken Bagstad. So I would like to say that, first of all, my neoclassical colleagues probably aren't even thinking about it, but I know in all my classes that we're looking at everything through a lens of equity this semester, and last semester too. It's really just created a whole new set of conversations that are taking place in my classes, and I would also say that students are looking at, they're planning an Earth Week celebration for April, and it's, has equity involved in it, right? And I would also say that I had the distinct privilege, I'm saying that kind of sarcastically, of teaching 3 sections of a freshman seminar last semester. And when we talk about diversity, it really is, students are on it. This is, I'm starting to see that the incoming students, they are conversant in the terms, they know the ideas, and whether thanks to social media or not, I mean, it is just really promising that students from all different majors are, talking about diversity and equity and stuff like that, and they're really concerned about it. So that gives me hope that, yeah, definitely an opportunity to raise the profile of ecological economics. I'm trying. So I think that's a way we need to, USSEE needs to push that out there too, providing curriculum for that maybe. So great suggestion, Ken. So
we have
go ahead.
one last question here. I know it's 4 o'clock, but let's see if we can do one more. Because in a practical sense, is it possible, given the current state of the planet, to move away from the vicious circle to a virtuous one if the attempt to achieve justice is leading to more injustice?
Depends on when you ask. I think personally it's whether I'm optimistic about that possibility or not. What I would say is that in order to accomplish that, I think we have to think about what institutions we have that can help lead us to that moment, and where we can build these sort of coalitions and alliances that would allow us to challenge the current vicious cycle of our economy. And I think what COVID-19 has presented is, outside of the realm of the environment, just how much our current capitalist economy chews up and spits out large swaths of the human population, right? We've seen just in the United States, tens of millions of people who have become unemployed. We've seen lines of food banks that go around the corner. And not all of these people may be thinking about environmental justice on a day-to-day basis, right? Or environmental sustainability on a day-to-day basis, but you can connect with them clearly on something in the economy isn't right, right? So there's something that doesn't work with an economy that gives people, that first of all puts people in such precarious positions to begin with, and one, completely dumps them when there's a crisis. And so I think, for instance, when you think about the labor movement or other movements for justice in different realms, I think there are ways in which you can see movements coming together to make that change. But I think that's what it's going to have to be. It has to be a ground up movement, and not a movement where we're sort of relying on, in a vacuum, just our leaders from the top down to be able to make those decisions for us.
So another question, does the new administration define environmental justice the same way as EE?
Yeah, I started to reply to that in the chat, but I think it's still yet to be determined. And again, I think that raises a good question of, how should ecological economics try to grapple with or straddle the EJ idea, equity versus EJ idea. So, but Jeff, I think that brings up a great point, that I think it's still too new. The new administration is still too new in terms of their, what their platform will be, although they've been signing executive orders for it. But I still think that that brings up a great point in general of what ecological economics needs to do. Phil, you have something?
And I would just add to that historically, presidential administrations have leaned towards the environmental equity side. So in 1994, Bill Clinton signed the executive order moving the office from equity to justice. But since that, not much has actually changed in terms of the actual administration of exploring environmental justice. It's still been focused on the distribution of environmental hazards and risks relative to communities of color and low-income populations. Obviously, some administrations have done better than that than others. I won't go into names, but some have done better than others. But the focus has largely stayed the same. And so I think, to Regina's point, we'll have to see first what the current administration stands towards environmental sustainability as broadly, and then from there, it'll give us some sense as to what the realm of possibility is for their approach to environmental justice.
All right, well, those are all the questions we have. Thank you so much, Regina and Phil. And I put a message in the chat box for everyone here that we will make a recording of this presentation available on the USSEE website. And for everyone that signed up through Eventbrite, you will get an email with a link to that recording once it's available.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for your input.
Thank you all for coming.